So welcome all. This is going to be fun. We're going to do three things. We're going to talk about the state of our media, we're going to talk about the state of our politics, and we're going to talk about the state of Pennsylvania. So we have the three experts here, and Laura, I want to begin with you. Let's talk about the media because you are very much part of it. I should tell you that I wake up and go to bed with two women. I do. My wife and Laura Coates. Laura is on, think about this, 7 to 9 a.m.
Context.
Yes. Laura's on 7 to 9 a.m. on SiriusXM, channel 124, anytime on the SiriusXM app. And she's on 11 o'clock at night at CNN. So she gets no sleep, but you're very much part of this. So welcome to Erie. First time here?
I love it, though. And I also, you brought me chocolate. What was the name of the company?
What do you think?
Romelo's. Well, I had the sponge candy. I let it melt, as you told me.
Of course.
I had the peanut butter one. I had the caramel one. I had some free time this afternoon.
Yeah.
It's delicious.
We'll have to get you some more. Our media today, it is fractured, it is polarized, and I think it's really driving the political divisions in this country. How so?
Well, I think in part it's because the term media has become so amorphous. If I say to each one of you what your media is, it'll likely be a different source. It'll likely be a different curated experience. It's oftentimes like the algorithm base of Netflix, where it will provide you with areas that they think you might be interested in. But it might mean you miss the forest through the trees at times, because with a curated experience, you're not going to be exposed to that which you would not necessarily and initially be interested in. But what is in the periphery, whether it's your echo chamber or beyond, what's in the periphery is going to be the most impactful and will have an impact on your lives as well. And so part of that fracture becomes the point where we're very distant from one another. We decide who we want. We have self-checkouts at many stores. You can choose to opt in to communication or not. And as a result, you consume media in a similar way. And that's part of why there's divisions. You can feel as though where it used to be your lawn sign would tell you what your neighbor felt, now you don't have that indication. It's much more reclusive. But in doing so, the media has a responsibility, I think, for so many reasons, and we've talked about this, ladies, in ensuring that you don't simply give the people, quote unquote, what they want. You give the information. And the information is supposed to be objective. It's supposed to be nonpartisan. It's supposed to be comprehensive and nuanced. And it's supposed to be in detail. And what you do with that information is up to you. But there are so many people who now consider themselves to be journalists in a variety of ways that by virtue of them having a microphone or a camera, they think, well, I'm an authoritative figure and give you the information, when it's really not the case. And if you don't have the standards that are established in terms of ethics, in terms of sourcing, in terms of trying to fact check in the data, you are contributing to misinformation, and thereby contributing to people having the belief that what they think is accurate. I'm not talking, my husband will tell me all the time, you can tell me what to do or how to do it, but not both, right? I tell him something different though. I tell him both ways. But in reality, I can only give you information. You decide what you want to think about it and what you think with that information. And I personally feel a great deal of responsibility to provide the accurate, comprehensive, and in-depth information, even if it means that at times people believe that there is so much more that you're not telling, and we've already exhausted all the resources.
So don't go to the sites that reaffirm your point of view, but where you're going to learn and educate. Karen, I want to turn to you to talk about the state of politics, but before we do that, you were trending on social media today. David Urban, who was here a few weeks ago, was rather upset that he did not get any Gannon swag, so we're going to need to fix that. You made a stop at Slippery Rock, and we're going to get to politics in just a moment, but what is that all about?
Okay. So I am a proud graduate of the University of Texas, and when I was in school, the University of Texas is a very big football school, and we had a really bad team for those years. So there was a legendary announcer at all the football games, and he would break up our despair by announcing the score of a school that was doing a lot better than we were. He would announce the Slippery Rock score every game at halftime. So Slippery Rock developed this kind of cult following at the University of Texas to the point where Wally Pryor missed a game, and whoever was filling in for him forgot to announce the Slippery Rock score, and the whole crowd started chanting, "Slippery Rock, Slippery Rock." Anyway, so as I was coming here a few years ago, and Ben is driving me, and we're on the highway, and there is a road sign that said Slippery, and I just lost it in the car. So today he did make a stop, and they presented me with a basket full of t-shirts and hats and sweatshirts that I am going to be the envy of all my fellow University of Texas grads.
Well, welcome back to Western Pennsylvania. So, Karen, I think I speak for the rest of the country. We are just so excited about a Trump-Biden rematch in 2024.
It was such a thrill the last time.
But in all seriousness, we're also seeing some uncertain avenues with RFK Jr., Joe Manchin maybe, Jill Stein, Dr. Cornel West, a whole rise of third-party candidates. And look, we know the role of third parties in 2016, and we are now facing the possibility that we could see a Trump-Biden rematch and perhaps a race that could go to the House of Representatives. So just size up where we are now, realizing November of 2023 may look different in September of 2024.
Yeah, I mean, and just as we should always start with every caveat, polls are snapshots, they are not predictors. But the fact is that this looks like pretty close to a 50-50 country, and because of the electoral college system, it's likely to be decided in 6 states. And the irony is not lost that I am here talking to people in Erie, Pennsylvania, and giving them my views on politics when I should be asking you your views, because, this is like as crucial an area as we are going to see in this next election. So will an RFK Jr. or a, Jill Stein matter in the national vote? Probably not, but what we did see, for instance, in 2016, and the Clinton people had the data for it, there was, right the weekend before the election, James Comey made an announcement, that they were reopening and closing the investigation with her.
We remember.
And yes, and in some places, like Michigan, the data shows that a number of young people that Hillary Clinton was counting on voted for Jill Stein. Did that throw the race? Did Ralph Nader throw the race in Florida in 2000? I mean, it doesn't take a lot of people to change the outcome in some of these very crucial, critical states, of which this is one.
So Lisa Adams is not a Slippery Rock alum. She's a Grove City alum just down the road. But we are in a swing county, in a swing state. The winner of Pennsylvania, I think, will be the next president. Talk about the state and what we're seeing in Northwest Pennsylvania, and educate us on why this is such a bellwether county right now.
Well, I think we're a bellwether county because I believe Erie County voters are smart people. And I think that we are a county that's made up economically of so many different forces. I mean, we're agriculture, we're eds and meds, we're old industry, we're new industry. And so there are so many different types of people here, and I think that was the mistake that was made when there was so much national attention on us in 2020. Because I think some of the national journalists who came here and upset people from Erie so much, they had a story in their mind before they got here, rather than coming here to Erie to find out what the story was. Why did Erie go for Trump? That's what everybody wanted to know. So it's nice to get that kind of attention, and we enjoyed having the national media attention, but they didn't always do a fair job of representing who we are. I mean, at the very time that we were investing millions and taking advantage of the opportunity zones legislation to invest in our own community, that wasn't part of the story. So the one reporter that made everyone so unhappy came back to town, sat down with Tim DeCastro. I was in the other room of the Erie Insurance house where she did the interview. She did a second piece and she didn't use any sound from that interview. I was really disappointed in that. But I think we're swingy because people have always split their tickets here. They always make their mind up, race by race. But I have to say, you know, I saw Kristen Welker with a panel of voters from Bucks County a couple of weeks ago, and she asked them, you know, how many of you are excited about a Trump-Biden rematch? Raise your hand. No one raised their hand. And so she kind of went around the table as to who they were going to be for and why, and if they would just be voting only for their platform, would they be excited about voting for the candidates? And I really feel that what she was talking to Bucks County voters about is kind of what I'm hearing on the ground here too. We had so much tension here, even before 2016's race. I mean, I have red shoes on tonight, but our news director wouldn't let us wear red or blue on election night for the last couple of cycles. I mean, we used to think, oh, it's patriotic. I'll wear this red dress. I'll wear this blue suit. We were told purple, black and white, anything but red or blue. We actually had security hired to be with us for some of our live shots on election night at the ballot box outside of the courthouse, the drop box, or to just have extra security at the TV station because people were so vitriolic. I mean, people would call us after a story ran. They would, and we're very accessible in local news, by the way, so if people don't like what your story was, they'll let you know. But they would call and say, I know you're for this person, like to us as journalists. Well, what we tried to do is present a fair story, and we interviewed people, and we wanted you to hear their point of view, but I know you're this way, and why didn't you ask this, or why didn't you say that? I mean, I can tell you, we had many calls like that to our newsroom.
I'm so shocked because that never happens in the national media. So let me go back to you, Laura, because if you look at the state of the country today, a bipartisan infrastructure bill, roads and bridges, high-speed rail, we're investing in that. Inflation is stabilized. It was high, it's come down. If you want a job, you can get a job. But let's be honest, people are in a sour mood. Why?
Well, I think sometimes when, we're talking about the national GDP, people are not thinking that most of us are thinking about our personal wallets. We're thinking about the price of groceries, what your day-to-day life is like. One of the reasons that local media is so impactful in particular is because all politics is local. And so while some people think that it's important to focus on only that which comes out of Washington, D.C. and New York, most of us never live there, don't live there. And so it's going to have some impact on your day-to-day life, but not on every aspect. And so I think people feel as though there's a disconnect in the coverage. They feel as though there's quote-unquote flyover country. I'm from Minnesota. I certainly understand the idea of being ignored and thinking only when it's valuable are you looked at. As a black woman and a voter, only when it's convenient do you come to where I am and then ask for my input or advice or where you're going to vote. And so I know the idea of the fickleness and how impactful and frustrating it can be. Now you combine that with people feeling like they're ignored, feeling as though they're also, from Trump voters I've spoken to or those who have talked at the base and beyond, that the frustration in part has been people do not want to be condescended to and made to feel stupid. That whatever you don't believe, if I don't believe what you believe, then only one of us is intelligent. Period, full stop, right? So if we not just disagree, if you don't believe what I believe, you are less than me. And that fuels a grievance-based, it fuels a disconnect, it fuels a complete and total distancing from the establishments that you ought to feel represented by. And then the media becomes that other extension. I mean, you're talking about the assumptions that are made. I mean, if I say 1 + 1 is 2 on air, totally objective, they go, she's a black woman, that liberal Democrat. I go, on the other hand, 2 and 2 is 4. Oh, what a sellout. She's a Republican, isn't she? Like, it's the same conversation that's happening. But no matter what you're saying, as long as you're, if you're thinking about it in terms of your viewpoints and your only perspective is so myopic, it can be a problem. But I think ultimately it's the disconnect. It's that people feel like they're not being heard, and they are believing and enticed by those who will say, I see you, I hear you, I feel the same way, even if what they hear, see, and feel is either disingenuous, a ploy, or something totally different than what you're seeing, feeling, and hearing. But at the end of the day, I think people just want to feel as though they're not judged by the choices they make, hence the reason you've got an exit poll so distinct from the ultimate election outcome, because you have a camera in front of you saying, how'd you vote? And they're aware of what cancel culture feels like, they're aware of what it's like to have a differing viewpoint, and they'll lie in front of you and then vote their personal truth, even if they are basing their vote on misinformation.
Karen, let's talk about the Republican Party, because you literally wrote the book on Nancy Reagan, and you spent how many years at the Reagan Library researching that book?
4.5.
So my question is, how did we go from the party of Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Mitt Romney to Donald Trump?
Well, I think that Ronald Reagan, there was a lot of public anger that Ronald Reagan tapped into. But I think he had much more traditional, what at least I grew up believing were conservative ideas than some of the things that the Republicans today have embraced. I mean, he was pro-free trade, he was a strong internationalist, and he was, I think, a shot of optimism at a time the country felt that it badly needed it. And I think today's Republican Party has really focused on people's grievances. And the most interesting interview I've ever done with Donald Trump was one about 5 days before he was inaugurated. And I was asking him, what people do not realize is that 5 days after the 2012 election, Donald J. Trump of Fifth Avenue in New York filed with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Again, this is the 2012 election, a trademark of the phrase, "Make America Great Again." You can see it still on their website. He sent in a $300 check. It's the exact same block letters that you saw on the hats 4 years later. And, Mitt Romney had just lost. The Republican Party was in a tailspin. They thought we're gonna have to become more inclusive. We're gonna have to reach out to women and young people and Latinos. And Donald Trump saw something, grievance in the country that nobody else was seeing at the time. It was completely instinctual. And he told me, he said, I decided I was gonna run the day after the election, so of course, the first thing I thought of was, what will my slogan be? I mean, he's such a brander, and he went through with me all of the things that the different slogans he thought of and rejected. And then he said, and then I came up with "Make America Great Again." And I said, well, Ronald Reagan used that too.
Exactly.
And he said,
1979.
and his response was, yes, but he didn't trademark it.
So Lisa, when you're talking to voters in this part of the state, what are they telling you? What's the mood?
Well, we haven't really been talking to voters, certainly, about the presidential race yet. Donald Trump came here in July, a very early appearance here. And although there was a decent turnout for his event at the Erie Insurance Arena, it was nothing like the turnout attendance-wise that he had in prior visits here. He came here in 2018 when he wasn't running, a couple years into his presidency, and there were so many people on French Street. French Street was closed, people couldn't get in, they watched on a screen outside. I mean, there was an incredible turnout. It wasn't like that when he announced that he was coming on sort of short notice in the
But he's a
summers.
former president, so there's a difference.
That's true. So we're not really talking about it yet, but we don't see, again, what we were feeling before, just the general divide in the country. You know, can you go to Thanksgiving, even after the hanging chads? I mean, can you go to Thanksgiving and talk to your family about the election? You know, how do you, we used to, like, let's interview a psychologist about how to handle Thanksgiving dinner, with your family. We would think of these story ideas. But we just had, obviously, our municipal elections, and a couple of things were interesting there. One, as far as Pennsylvania goes, and as far as Erie County specifically goes, we have a lot more voters who are unaffiliated with a party than we've had before. So I don't remember numbers very well, but I mean, we have 23,000, almost 24,000 unaffiliated or independent voters here, 80,000 and change Democrats, 67,000 Republicans registered for the election that we just had. So there used to be a much bigger Democrat advantage in the county, in all of Erie County, than there is now, but there's this very large number of independents. And there's been some talk about, should we have an open primary in Pennsylvania? I mean, one of our state senator here has talked about, should there be an open primary in Pennsylvania? But
There should be, yes. Let me just say, yes, it's time. This is the most antiquated election system in the country here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Well,
just saying.
I can't weigh in on that because I'm a reporter, so. But I will say, the other interesting factor is I heard Ronna McDaniel making the circuit on the talk shows this morning, and she was talking about how well Republicans were doing with this idea of bank your vote, bank your vote. Well, that's the branding for the idea of voting earlier, voting by mail. But I mean, we just had a couple of races here where if you looked at the turnout at the ballot box, one candidate won. But we had almost 20,000 mail-in ballots here in our county. 14,000 plus went to the Democratic candidates, and 3,000 and change went to the Republican candidates. So, you have to sort of think, well, if it wasn't for mail-in voting, would the race have gone differently? Or what if you took a percentage? Well, maybe 20% of the people who mailed in maybe would have gone to the polls, but we don't really know how to evaluate that. But if the GOP thinks it's got the message out to do mail-in voting, that this is the future now, folks, it really hasn't reached here because there was a big difference here in our election.
And it's
Go ahead, Karen.
because Donald Trump has been telling people don't trust mail ballots.
And he was in Claremont yesterday saying one-day voting. Oh, by the way, the states have the election laws, not the federal government, but that's it. So let's talk about the issues in this campaign, because the economy is going to be a driving force. It's the economy, as James Carville said. The war between Israel and Hamas is a factor. The war in Ukraine is a factor. But to me, the other motivating issue we saw in Ohio, in Virginia, in Kentucky is going to be abortion. How big of an issue? How big of a motivating force on both sides, Democrats and Republicans?
I think it's a huge motivator. I think in so many elections, even following Roe v. Wade, abortion was always on the ballot. Maybe it was an invisible ink, but there was a really big, important decision to be made. Many times it manifested in the form of who would be the Supreme Court justices to try to overturn it. That became a very common ploy among presidential candidates who wanted to have their list of justices who would be in a position to then overturn Roe v. Wade. At the same time, during their confirmation hearings would always happen. No, I honor precedent. I have no intention of ever doing anything different. And then when you have the gavel in one's hand and one can do what you'd like, there's a different story being told. And so I think the fact that Roe v. Wade was always on the ballot tells you just how extraordinary it has been and impactful for people to turn out for that. Now that it's not on the ballot, now that it's not on the books as current precedent, and it's returned to the states, I think there was a bit of a cutting off one's nose to spite their face. It wasn't anticipated that by returning it to the states, it would mean that people would decide for themselves. I think the assumption was, once Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Dobbs decision and went to the states, then you would have all sorts of trigger laws that went back into existence that would effectively ban it universally, even without a federal ban. what has turned out in places is that based on the data and the polling, that it's really a bipartisanly supported issue of abortion access, and that the Roe v. Wade formula of the different trimester framework was one that people seemed to glom onto and wanted staying power. And the idea of how it's being presented as an issue of feeling as though someone's dictating one's life to you is an unpopular notion. We've seen that already. But then you've got now some candidates who in the recent debate have made comments that suggest, I think we're not messaging this correctly. And again, it goes back to the idea of, no, I think you've messaged it. People have decided. And they're not silly about what they've decided. They have made it quite clear. And then the goalpost gets moved again. Well, hold on. Did you decide, well, what I think you don't understand is we're talking about this. And they say, we do know what you're talking about. So I think the way it's being discussed, if it's in the context of, I know better than you, whether it's any issue, there is a real aversion people have, a real visceral reaction to being told what to do, what to think, and that the government, as going back with Reagan, who made the comment, the scariest words in the English language is the government, I'm the government, I'm here to help. That resonates again for people. So I think that's something that's been lost on a lot of the candidates, to suggest that what they believed from the Supreme Court precedent would be a foregone conclusion is really not there. And unless the candidates pivot with an eye towards accepting that the states and the people have decided, as opposed to telling them you decided incorrectly, you will fail each time.
And Karen, I want to get your response. It comes at a time in which the credibility of the Supreme Court is at a record low.
And I think that obviously Ohio, the referendum there got the most attention, but I thought...
And Kansas.
But I think the most interesting abortion, to me at least, last week was in Virginia, because Governor Glenn Youngkin, whose presidential stock is not quite as high this week as it was last Monday, thought that he had come up with what could have been kind of a safe middle ground for Republicans on abortion, which is also something Nikki Haley talks about, which is limit it at 15 weeks. Now, mind you, 93% of all abortions in this country take place in the first 13 weeks. Most people who get abortions get them fairly early if they can get access. But it turned out it failed in Virginia, and even though if you ask people, most people are pretty uncomfortable with the idea of a second trimester abortion, or even in some cases a third trimester abortion. But I think what we saw in Virginia was they don't want the government making that decision. They don't want the government drawing that lines. They may think that you're going to burn in hell if you have a 14-week abortion. But I mean, I think most people have decided that's kind of God's decision. And I think that Republicans are going to, the idea that is still supported by Tim Scott and others of having a national abortion ban is just going to be a non-starter. And I think it has really been interesting to watch Donald Trump on this issue, because he's criticized his own party for driving away people. He is saying this should truly, truly be a local decision, even as he is sort of bragging about the fact that he's the one who appointed all those justices who did this. I mean, this is just, the Republicans, the anti-abortion movement finally caught the car. And it's going to be, I think, something that Republicans are going to continue to struggle with. Will it be the front and center issue next year? I'm not totally sure, but the Republicans have not found their way out of the situation that they have put themselves in.
Lisa, let's talk about the Democrats. Let's talk about the president. He is soon to be 81 years old. Happy birthday, Mr. President. The oldest president in American history. And that is the #1 issue that comes up in every poll, every conversation. And maybe it's not the age, it's the way he is presenting himself. Do you have a sense about how the president is viewed here in Pennsylvania, his home state, from the other end in Scranton? And then, Laura, I'd love to get your thoughts as well.
Wow, that's a really big question. I mean, I think for me to have a broad view of what is all of Pennsylvania think of Joe Biden, that's pretty tough. I will say we do hear the age concern everywhere, and I don't think it's his age so much as how he has been, his carriage lately. You know, how he seems sometimes like he's shuffling, or he mixes up where he is, or he doesn't say what he intended to say. So I think that gives anybody pause. But yeah, other than that, I'm just not sure. I mean, his potential opponent, there's not a big difference in his age either, and he also has misspoken about where he was. I mean, there was a time that he was in Erie, and he said, "Do you think I'd want to come to Erie? You know, and then he had to kind of walk that back. But so, yeah, we've seen those kinds of gaffes, I think, on both sides for these candidates. So I think that whoever the speechwriter is at this moment in time, like right after Hamas attacked Israel, I think Joe Biden's first couple of statements and speeches after that were very strong, and people were really very pleased with how he was handling the situation as it's devolving here. I mean, as it's becoming increasingly challenging and more people are worried about that widening, I think people are not so sure. And I think we sort of wondered if that might affect elections here. You know, how are people feeling about the Biden administration in light of what's going on with these wars right now? Would that affect the local elections? But certainly in Pennsylvania and here in Erie County, Democrats did very well on election night.
But Laura, just yesterday, the former president referred to Barack Obama in the White House, not Joe Biden, and he confused the president of Hungary in a speech. But you could dismiss that because it's ad lib. But there is a difference between how Joe Biden and Donald Trump present themselves to the electorate, even though 3 years separate the two of them.
I think you can see sort of the psychology of how people view youth through Donald Trump's reaction to his various prosecutions. Contemplative diplomacy and sort of guarded hedge language is that of an elder statesman, somebody who we used to think about that being a very respectful tone that you take, somebody who would be who would be the opposite of rash, who would wait and think before they spoke, and the pauses that would come make you think this person is all the more credible. Counter that and compare that to what Donald Trump does. He's defiant, he's fighting, he's petulant, he's enraged, he's talking in the courthouse, he's going against the judge. He's doing things that in some respects you maybe at this college might have seen in your own classrooms, right? Because you think to yourself, this is the fight is that of the youth. And for that reason, not only is there a political consequence of trying to avoid being prosecuted and criminally convicted, there is a psychology that accompanies it. Those who fight feel young to you. Those who have the fight left in them. Those who are willing to buck the system and go at it and be, and refuse to conform feel youthful to you. But that's very different than what we actually think about in politics and what you would love to have. You decide, you're the voters. But knee-jerk reactions are what you assign to the youth. Those who can think logically through a flowchart analysis and have the foresight to predict the consequences of one's words and then withholds them and prudently speaks, used to be a thing that you would applaud and consider leadership qualities. So I think that's what's happening oftentimes with Trump, and I think he's keenly aware of what can read and translate as youthful and a fighter for you. A fighter for you. If I fight this way for myself, if I'm willing to do this for myself, then clearly I must be a champion for you. That's how they think about it. But also, there is a sentiment, certainly, that's been happening across the country, and it can't be denied. Similar to how Congresswoman AOC was treated, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She was patted on the head and condescended to by the likes of the former Speaker Pelosi, along with the squad, because she was naive to believe that her youth would serve her, and that institutional knowledge was the goal. And that gets flipped on its head by the electorate who feel, well, hold on a second. I want to raise my hand and feel as though the way it's always been, if it doesn't work for everyone, should not persist. So the psychology is happening, is my point. And I think if you really think about what it is that makes you believe Donald Trump seems more youthful, you will get an insight into a campaign strategy and why the fight is that much more important.
I also think, though, this language with Trump, I mean, we're inured to it now. We've been hearing this sort of thing for 8 years. He mocked John McCain's war record. He picked a fight with the Pope. He kept doing things that should have killed him. And instead, they sort of oddly made him stronger. And I think there's a fair amount of evidence that so far these prosecutions are playing to his benefit. I mean, he raised money off his mugshot. So I don't know if that will be the case if he gets convicted of something, but right now he is portraying himself as a martyr. He is using the phrase, "I am your retribution," and so far with his base, it is just energizing them more.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to say, though, I mean, I watched the Republican debate last week. I think not.
You were one of the two that watched it, I
That's what I
think.
was going to say.
The ratings were horrible.
The ratings were not good, but
Horrible, as Donald Trump would
my
say.
husband and I made the popcorn and we sat down to watch. I think that the tone, even there, because of how politics has changed, even the tone there, at one point I just thought, they all sound angry on every single answer. It's a lot less of a view of, I'm hopeful about this and this is how we get there. They all sort of sound angry, and then of course there were some really sort of uncalled for quips between them. I mean, I don't usually think in terms of sexist, feminist. I think people are people, and I'm going to listen to them all. Right. But I did think those were sexist remarks directed at Nikki Haley, but I don't think I would say call someone scum. So at the same time, I was sort of surprised at where she went in her response to that. But I thought that they all sounded angry in all of their answers, and it's exhausting to listen to.
So let's talk about the leading issue among those other candidates. What size heel are you wearing, by the way?
One I can run in. What did she say?
There you go.
5-inch, but you have to be able to run in them.
So let's just game this out for just a moment. Bear with me. Donald Trump is off the stage. Of those in the race right now, who is the Republican nominee? Of current candidates.
Oh, sorry, did my head swivel? Sorry. Sorry. I mean, great question. Let me answer it optimistically. Well,
Let me phrase it. Nikki Haley, how serious of a contender is she?
I think she is. I think that her stock as a contender has increased exponentially because of her foreign policy experience and chops. I think prior to what's been happening with the Israel-Hamas war, and remember the very first debate with Vivek Ramaswamy, when she really emerged and elevated in a greater fashion because she pointed out what he was lacking, and although he was center stage and his views on, remember Mike Pence was still in the race at that time, on those issues. I think her background as in her foreign policy and the governor has helped her. I think the most serious contenders, though, really appear to still be DeSantis and Nikki Haley, just based on polling alone. Now, I think that could change, though, if, for example, if Donald Trump were not in the race, I think the floodgates would open in a different direction. If Biden were not in the race, I think the floodgates open in a different direction, and those who would be able to beat him and beat others as well would change. So I think the jury is still out, but the point is, there's a runaway first place contender, and that's Donald Trump, and he won't even debate. Why? I think you were talking about this earlier. he knows full well if he debates, he would have to address something other than himself. And if he does that, he's off brand, off message. And he's well aware that they're all trying to nip at his heels because decorum is not a winning strategy. If you believe that vengeance and division is what can make you win. And so the longer he remains sort of Coke, and everyone else Diet Coke and Coke Zero, why would I want that instead? It's not like Dr. Pepper, which tastes more like regular Dr. Pepper, right? If you have Trump in the race, why consider the second person? But I think so far it's Nikki Haley and DeSantis.
Yeah, I think it's pretty traditional that people who have a big lead don't want to debate. Yeah. Incumbents never want to debate, at least not if they're ahead of things. But again, my predictive powers have always been pretty weak. But going forward right now, I think that if none of these other candidates can take a nick out of Trump in Iowa, I think it's pretty much over. If he comes out of Iowa with a big burst of wind, that is going to carry him right through New Hampshire, right through South Carolina. And an overlooked factor, I think, in this race is this is the third time he's run for president. And Trump 3.0 looks very, very different than Trump 1.0, where it was him and a couple of people kind of living off the land, or 2.0 when he was running as an incumbent. He's got a very professional team this time around. And there's not the kind of backbiting and intrigue that you've seen in his previous campaigns. And what they are quietly doing is going around in every single individual state and rewriting the delegate selection rules in Donald Trump's favor. So if they can't stop him in the first few contests, I mean, he essentially got them to rewrite the rule in California so that if he can win 50% and plus one vote, he gets all the delegates. It is so expensive to compete in California that the other candidates are going to have trouble even going there. And in a number of states, his people have talked the state party into having caucuses. Those completely play to Trump's advantage because the militant activists are the people who show up for caucuses. So again, once you get past those first 3 or 4 contests, they have rewritten the rules of the road very, very much in his favor.
I will say that too, just remember coming up in a legal aspect of it, Colorado is still trying to, and there are some litigants trying to disqualify him from the ballot based on the 14th Amendment and the Insurrection Clause. They're going to have closing arguments this coming Wednesday, and the judge has 48 hours to decide whether he actually will be on the ballot or not. Now, one state not going to be the most consequential, but if it becomes a blueprint for the primary or the general election, as it is in Minnesota, where the Supreme Court said, we're not buying it at the primary level now, he stays on the ballot, I wonder how these blueprints will work in conjunction with what you've described.
When you're on CNN, how much is legal analyst with Donald Trump? How much is political analyst for you personally?
Oh, I think there is so much conflation. His political currency is also his legal currency and his financial and business currency. And so when you talk about Donald Trump and coverage, it can oftentimes be one and the same. I try to be very careful and intentional about talking about it from the legal perspective when necessary and politically when other times. But I think there is a lot, that is for him, the beauty of his campaign, that you have to squint and turn your eye and lean forward to know which is which.
But in terms of expressing your opinion, I guess Romulo's chocolate, you'd say thumbs up.
Double thumbs up.
Double thumbs up.
There's no hedging there. It was
There
excellent.
you go. Hey, Lisa, let's talk about the media. In all seriousness, you started at WICU in the early 80s, correct?
No, 1978.
Oh my gosh, okay. So as you look at the media landscape today and where people go for their information, just reflect on how it's changed in the last 35 to 45 years.
Well, I'm going to give a big shout out to TV here because we were hearing cable is going to ruin local news, and it has not. We do very well, and we are multi-platform. So, one of the things that was great always for TV is we could put it on the early news, and the newspaper might have the story, but they had to wait until they could print it the next day. Well, that all changed, when people started to have websites and put their stories online, so then it got very competitive again between print and broadcast. But it's interesting now, I have to take my phone with me and do a Facebook Live at my story and, put our stories out on different platforms. But we're doing really very well right now, and I think people kind of go back and forth between old and new media. But we started a 4 o'clock newscast because Ellen canceled her show, and we call it First at 4. And it starts out with real serious news. We can do the top 4 stories a day, talk about them a little bit, but then we start having live guests and interview people on the show, and I'm astounded at it's like the old days, the flow of people coming into the station in our lobby every day, and they're young, they're 20-somethings. Our group is having an event, can we come on the show to promote our event? Our play is opening. So it's kind of like the pendulum seems to be swinging back, and of course during COVID, we had live music in the lobby to make you feel better. We sent a drone out to shoot nature shots, just a moment of peace for you, and we would run that at the end of the newscast. So I think we're always reinventing ourselves,
Right.
but right now that's working. And I will say, I do have to keep my opinion out of some of the things that we're talking about here tonight, but I also have to say it's great that we're in a community that has great educational institutions, because we have political experts and we have analysts on a lot of different areas, then we know who they are, so we call them and they come in and give analysis to us as part of our news. One of our newscasts, Ethan, is digitally focused, where we talk about what's trending digitally, so we're trying to sort of wrap our arms around the whole thing as we go.
And I say this, well, it used to be, it would be in the Erie paper the next day, and now it's probably, 2 days later? Just saying. So, Laura, this is for you. How can we determine information versus disinformation? Good question.
Oh, that's tough, because things, it used to be that you could tell when somebody was sort of off their rocker, right? Now there's a now you can have presentation that looks professional enough that people think, oh, there you go. It must be true because it's out there. I think, I hate to say this because it puts an onus in many respects on the individual consumer to cross-reference, which is really not what we want. We want to be able to have one-stop shopping, ability to think that there's one credible source. But I think people more and more do have to have that cross-referencing, and to retain a healthy level of skepticism. I'm a former prosecutor, and I think it fueled me well to have skepticism at all times. I still have skepticism, and probably more than a healthy dose. But I think it's required if you really want to be informed, that just because you say it doesn't necessarily make it so. And to really question who it is that's saying it. We have so many pundits, and recognizing that if it's a pundit, that they're coming with a particular angle and perhaps an agenda. And so question the source of the information. Consider the source is my thought for everyone. And I think that there is, fortunately, a plethora of information out there to cross-reference in many respects. But, for me, I think that the way to tell misinformation from disinformation is, at times, you don't fall for the okey doke of, I think the phrase is always mainstream media, and that's supposed to be synonymous with non-truth telling. But remember, just because somebody has a microphone, present company excluded, and a camera around, doesn't mean that they have abided by the ethical journalistic standards, that there are people who are vetting, that there are people who are confirming that the sources, in fact, are there. That you should always question when somebody, breaks a story hours or days or weeks before somebody else, when they won't give over certain information, when there's no transparency, when they're not going to correct the record, when they don't endeavor to correct a record. These are not trusted news sources. When they're trying to tell you how to think as opposed to here is the information, not a trusted news source. But the way you have to do that, really, and that's part of your own education. We can't just be passive participants in an active democracy. And that requires us to sort of seek out information. I think the best source of information, hands down, is 11 p.m. weeknights with Laura Coates live on CNN. And that's Eastern time.
I agree.
But that's where you'll get the best news.
Steve, I think the pace of the news cycle today is where the temptation comes in to get something out there too quickly that may not be well vetted. And, you know, it's, I'm sure, a problem for all of us in this business, but I mean, we certainly saw it with the war that's going on in Gaza now, with that information of who bombed the hospital getting put out there too quickly. And even now, the death toll statistics of how many Palestinians have been killed, you know, how do we know whether to trust that or not? I mean, even at something at as large a scale as that, because it's harder for reporters to get where they need to get to verify that information. We don't know.
I'm reminded, to your point earlier, that famous quote by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you are entitled to your own set of opinions, but not your own set of facts, and that's playing out. Karen, this is a question for you. A previous speaker, and there's a few on this, suggesting that the key issue in the election next year is democracy. Is democracy on the ballot? Is this truly the most important election in our lifetime?
I do feel like, and I've covered a lot of elections, that this really is an election for all the marbles in a way I've never seen before. Presidential race is on a razor's edge. So is the House. So is the Senate. And yes, you know, our institutions are all on a razor's edge. But what I'm also seeing is that we are not the only country in the world where there is public sentiment rising in favor of authoritarianism. And there is a significant portion of the population who equate strong leadership with authoritarianism, trampling institutions, trampling guardrails. And I think that this is, and using a phrase that Ronald Reagan used in 1964, speaking for Barry Goldwater, this is a time for choosing. And this country is going to be making a real choice about what kind of country it wants to be.
Well, it's a follow-up. This is for you specifically, Laura Coates. What would a second Trump presidency look like?
Well, I think he's shown you, he's told you that vengeance is on the menu, that because he believes that he is the target and victim of a political witch hunt, where he believes, note my words, where he believes that the Department of Justice is the puppet of the sitting president of the United States, that he intends to exact vengeance on those who are perceived political enemies, and that he will use the Justice Department to ensure what he believes is a course correction to take it out on the other side. He's also made pretty clear about his views that he thinks he could have stopped the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, 24 whole hours. But he could be, by virtue of his sort of bombastic tone, ensure that everyone fears the United States and will fall in line with all of our policy objectives. But I think he also is very clear that it is his intention to ensure that the division is capitalized and in favor of those who support him. Now, all of that, you mentioned a more professional staff this third time around. I think there is an issue with who will surround him if he were to be the second time president. Because the so-called adult in the room we came to hear about during the first time, when people would say, well, I joined the administration, I want to be the adult in the room. Many of them have no appetite to join again. Many of them don't have the legal fees to join the administration again, frankly. So I think you're going to see people who have learned lessons about how to use an absence of transparency to their advantage and to use the system for their liking. So I think in many respects, a Trump second presidency, he's told you what it is. If that should be your particular taste, I think you'll have to swallow it whole.
And a follow-up to that, Karen, any thoughts, if Trump is the nominee, as you indicated, who the VP is?
Oh, boy. I think...
It's not Mike Pence, we know
It's
that.
definitely not Mike Pence. I have been completely kind of befuddled by Tim Scott's campaign. And I do, kind of get this...
He's got a girlfriend now.
Well, he does have a girlfriend now, but he's also, he's also, I feel like in the debates, he's almost auditioning for running mate. And so, it may be that somebody like a Tim Scott is who Trump goes with. He may go for a hot woman, and they're Kristi Noem or Carrie Lake. But I think what he is not going to go for, which he needed last time, he needed Mike Pence because he needed somebody to be essentially his validator with the evangelicals. He's not going to feel like he needs this. And I think he is also not going to want somebody who would come into the office with their own power base and their own ability to challenge him.
Another follow-up, this is for you specifically, Karen. Would Ronald Reagan recognize today's Republican Party?
Ronald Reagan would have been driven out of this party as a rhino. He was an internationalist. He favored open immigration. In fact, he embraced the word amnesty about the people who were living in the country illegally. There are a few things. He ran up big deficits, or we thought they were big at the time, nothing compared to what we live with now. So no, I don't think that he would necessarily even recognize this party.
Who wrote this one? If not Biden, who? Go Colonels, go Rock. Who's that from? There you go.
If not Biden, who?
Yeah, Go Colonels, that's Strong Vincent High School. Well, it used to be a high school, now it's a middle school. And Go Slippery Rock. But if not Biden, who?
I think the Democratic Party has an incredibly impressive bench if you look outside of Washington, and specifically if you look at the governors. You look at somebody like Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, who has completely, that state is now top to bottom run by the Democrats, which was not the case when she was elected. You look at Roy Cooper, who has been elected twice the governor of North Carolina. You look at a Josh Shapiro, if he'd been governor for more than 20 minutes, he'd be, I just think, again, I think that if you look outside of Washington, the Democrats have an incredible crop of talent right now rising, and these are people who are proving that they can speak to voters outside the activist base of their own party. And I think if Joe Biden does not win this election, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing going around, because his decision to run would have roadblocked a lot of people who would have been able to make their own cases.
Let's be honest. if Ruth Bader Ginsburg had retired earlier, we would not have Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. So that is part of her legacy. And of course, if Trump wins, that will be part of the Biden legacy. Where's Cheyenne? Where's Cheyenne, 10 years old?
Oh, one more.
Come on up here.
I forgot to
on
mention
up.
that
Come here, Shane.
a
Come on up.
Democrat just won election as governor of Kentucky as well. So
I'm going to have you ask this question because come on over here. Get over here.
Give the mom time
come
to
on the
video.
stage.
Don't give the mom time to record.
I wish I was, at 10 years old, I wish I was this smart. I'm going to give you the microphone. You can ask your question.
What will happen if the war, Israel and Hamas war, if Trump gets elected in the future?
Great question. Thank you. Before you answer, tell me a little bit about yourself.
My name is Cheyenne. I'm 10 years old. And I love politics.
Will you run for office someday?
Huh?
Will you run for office?
Yeah, I want to run. I want to be a president when I grow up.
There you go. Thank you. Save the picture. Thank you for the question. Who wants to answer it? The war in Israel. Thank you, Cheyenne. Another round of applause. Thank you very much.
Wow, very impressive. I have a 10-year-old son myself, and so I'm very impressed. Good for you. I'm glad you have the foresight to ask the question. You know, I think it's a question for all of us, really, in terms of what would happen. But I can tell you from the reporting that I've done and heard and seen and collectively talked about, it's very clear that whoever becomes the next president of the United States is going to have to think 12 steps ahead. Not just about what is happening right now within the month of the Israel-Hamas war starting, but what happens to Gaza next? Who will be in control of it next? What will be the impact of the humanitarian crisis that is spiraling out of control, that was out of control prior to this, and now even more so? And the real test, I think, for support of what happens when you are faced with the prospect of losing the moral high ground to voters, to supporters, to those who will choose an aide about it. And I think it's a really, really difficult question to predict what will happen next, but it'll be really much harder if the next president of the United States does not think about it in a really holistic way, and not just in terms of what sounds good today, but what will ultimately be good for the region and the world 10 years from now. Great question.
Thank you. Karen, this is for you because the president will be in San Francisco meeting with President Xi Jinping of China. How big of a threat are we facing from China, and is the U.S. prepared?
No. I think that, the Biden administration has in many ways been fairly tough on China, and starting with the fact that they left Donald Trump's tariffs in place. But, we've talked a lot about how hard it's going to be to get Ukraine aid passed in this next round of funding. The other part of that package is funding for Taiwan. And I was speaking with a very, very senior Republican on Capitol Hill steeped in foreign policy, and he was referring to this Taiwan money as urgent. And I said, well, what's so urgent about this funding need for Taiwan? And he just said, if you could see what I'm seeing in the intelligence briefings, you wouldn't be asking me that question.
Lisa, this is for you as a journalist writing this question. Who asked this, by the way? Who's the journalist who's here? Talking about how the national media may parachute in, often mischaracterizing what's happening on the ground. And you've seen this in Erie.
Yeah, well, I touched on that a little bit. I mean, it certainly happened in 2020. 2020 was really a busy time here with national media coming in and coming out. Sometimes, if they were affiliates of ours, they reached out to us for an assist. And that doesn't mean us controlling how they do their story, but maybe providing some contacts or some places to go. So, I mean, I think I painted that picture a little bit earlier. I mean, there was a very depressing picture of what Erie County was about painted in this piece that the reporter CBS Jamie Yuccas did. I believe it was a CBS Online product that she was a part of. So again, that was just kind of disappointing, and I think it was unfair. But I do think that Erie is a bellwether because it is a cross-section of so many things. I like to say it's the center of the universe. I don't know if that's really true. But for example, they called this the summer of strikes, and we had a very big strike here at Wabtec, the former GE Transportation. And one of the main things that the union was talking about was, you can give us a modest pay increase, but the way inflation has gone since COVID, that means we're farther behind than we were. We're not even like holding the line. And I think that message was then repeated, across the country with the UAW. And of course, I'm in SAG-AFTRA, and the news side of it wasn't affected, but certainly the actor and the writers were on strike as well. So, but I don't think you can separate the economic issues, people's pocketbook issues, from what's going on in Israel and what's going on in Ukraine. Because look, we have these two big funding packages that are being talked about. The new Speaker of the House sort of wanted to keep Ukraine separate from that, or wanted, like you would do with your own family budget. Well, if we're going to spend money on this, what are we going to not spend money on? I mean, those seem like valid questions to ask to me, rather than we just keep sending aid. But at the same time, we want to make sure that these situations come to some kind of an end, so that people aren't suffering and fighting these wars endlessly. And I think Netanyahu right now, his story seems to change from day to day about what he sees. As Laura, you were talking about, what is the long view here? So, as the U.S. makes these decisions, as our government makes these decisions, I don't think that only the economy is going to be on the mind of Erie voters or Pennsylvania voters when the candidates do start coming here, because I don't think they can separate these global conflicts from their pocketbooks.
So final question for you, and you, Karen, coming from Washington, because you talk about the long view. Congress cannot even get a budget in place. I mean, that is job one. And so you have China thinking over the next 10 to 50 years. We're thinking the next 10 to 15 days.
Or you mean Friday?
Yeah. Groundhog Day.
Friday, right. Yes. I think, when we talk about the issues, and you were asked earlier about democracy in general, I think for most people, it's hard to know what is going to be the motivating factor. There's not going to be one come November. But what they want is the prospect that the person they choose is going to be able to get the job done. It's kind of like when you hire an employee. There are some things you're going to want them to have, skill set that is going to be coming to the job, and those that can be learned on the job. But you want somebody with the good bones to be able to get it done. You want to see that they have the potential. And I think what people see oftentimes in Washington, D.C., and they're choosing their representatives locally and beyond, is those who only have the potential to be provocateurs. Like, the whole point for them is to muck it up. And if that's what it is, there's no go.
Enough about Matt Gaetz, but go ahead now.
But it's also true that there are fewer. Steve, you probably have a better handle on this, but when I first got to Washington, there were hundreds of truly swing districts where the real election was in November, and you didn't know who was going to win, the Republican or the Democrat. That now the number of House elections, it's minuscule. You win your election in your primary, and your voters in a primary are as likely to reward you for what you stop from happening rather than what you actually get done. And people can blame this on gerrymandering, but the fact is the United States Senate has also become polarized that way. When I got to Washington, 60% of the Senate's voting record was somewhere between the most liberal Republican, and yes, there were liberal Republicans, and the most conservative Democrat. Now there's no overlap at all in how Republicans will vote on an issue versus how Democrats do. And, until the voters decide that this matters, these guys are being, and women are being rewarded for dysfunction.
You have teed up perfectly tomorrow night's conversation, so please join us with Val Demings, who was on the very, very, very short list to be VP. Many would argue she should have been VP. Representative from Florida, she will be joining us along with the former chair, the former lieutenant governor of the state of Maryland, Michael Steele, who is coming back for an encore performance. You're back for an encore. Hopefully you'll come back to Erie very quickly because the book sale is outside. Tell us about your 2 books. And Lisa, you can talk about the memoir that you're going to be working on. Go ahead, Laura.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for having us. This is my first time in Erie, won't be my last. I really have enjoyed my time, seriously. And hopefully, if I am able to come back with national media, we'll tell the right story, the accurate one of what Erie really is. My book is called Just Pursuit, and it really is a memoir, a compilation of essays based on my time as a federal prosecutor and the battle of allegiance one can often feel when they are different identities, and you can feel as though you're being pulled towards an allegiance with the United States and that with your community. Also, the frustrations of what it's like to be a progressive, some would say, prosecutor, in the sense that I believe in redemption, and that is always and can oftentimes be at odds with what the status quo is. But it tells the tale of what it's like to speak truth to power by speaking truth about power. And I think you'll love it. I mean, Rolling Stone called it a book for our generation. I don't know.
And you have 2 new books coming out, right?
I do. Well, I'm working on my 2nd and 3rd book now. One is a nonfiction collection of essays in the line of The Fire Next Time, and the other one is a thriller, a murder mystery set in Washington, D.C. Some of my colleagues might find their names in it, but really, I think this particular building, I won't kill any of them, don't get me wrong, but this building has given me a bit of a muse-based information, so thank you.
Yeah, I took her to the 2nd floor of the house next door, Strong Estate, and it's fascinating. So Laura will be doing the Laura Coates Show tomorrow morning from the CAM studio. So I'm not sure if CAM is here, but thank you for Community Access Media.
Pointing. Oh, thank you.
For hosting us.
I'm excited.
7 to 9 a.m. Eastern Time, and then stick around noon to 2 for the briefing. And then listen to her tomorrow night. Wake up and go to bed with Laura Coates. Karen, your book.
So mine, in 2016, shortly after Nancy Reagan died, Simon & Schuster came to me and asked me if I would be interested in writing a biography. And at the time, I'm such an astute political analyst, this was the fall of 2016, I thought, Hillary Clinton's going to be a pretty conventional president. I guess I need an outside project. But the book, it ended up taking me 4.5 years because I realized that by telling the story of this very complicated woman who really, she and Reagan were such a team. I mean, they compensated for each other's weaknesses, they bolstered each other's strengths, but I realized that as I was into it, that by telling this often overlooked, complicated story, that it was going to be, I hoped, another way of looking at the entire Reagan era. And so it ended up being a much kind of bigger endeavor.
It is a fabulous book. You also have to read the new Mitt Romney book by McKay Copeland. Yes. It's terrific. Very quickly, because we're running over time, the cover photograph, just explain how that was selected.
Simon & Schuster picked the cover photograph. What we wanted to do was to convey to people that this was a serious book. With Nancy Reagan, I think she was often dismissed as kind of a fashionista. So what books that were written about her before always had her in the kind of evening gown, or people dismissed her either, as an airhead or a, socialite, when in fact she was much, much more. So I was so thrilled when Simon & Schuster came up with what I thought was the kind of perfect photograph to sort of convey that this was a real serious book.
Lisa Adams, thank you for being here tonight. What a joy to have you on the panel.
So I want to say I'm really honored to be here with these two ladies, and I've been, following their work and listening to it a little more, knowing this evening was coming. When Ferky called me and said, "Would you like to be on a panel?" I assumed it was a panel where I would be asking the questions, not answering them. So I should have paid more attention to the phone call, but it's been my privilege to be here. I don't have a book to sign, but I will say that I asked both of the other guests here tonight if they think Joe Manchin's going to be a factor in the election, and I also asked them if they think this two-stage idea to keep the government from shutting down will or won't work. So if you tune in tonight at 11, you'll hear their answers.
That is a great tease. Erie's own Lisa Adams, thank you for being with us. Karen Tumulty, joining us via Slippery Rock, and the new fan of Romulo's Chocolate, Laura Coates. Thank you all, and thank you.